First, Dr. Gregory Coates, formerly of Oxford University, now teaching. He was our speaker for Elysia last year. Tremendous talk on the siege, and he gave us a lot of insights into how Caesar went about winning that famous battle. Today he's going to cover the battles of Philippi for us. They're quite interesting in the sense that the histories on the battle are a little bit, well, there are not many of them and they're written a lot later. And so there's quite a large scope for interpretation. And hopefully Gregory will give his interpretation, which I think you'll find very interesting. And this has been his area of research or within this period of the early, well, the late Republic, early Empire. So I'll hand over to Greg.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you hear me all fine, everything?
We can indeed. Thanks, Greg.
Excellent. If there's any issues with sound at any point, then please do interrupt and we'll try and fix it. So, the battles of Philippi is what I'm going to talk about today. And of course, it is the battles in the plural because there was more than one. There were two, and there were about 20 days separating them. And we're going to run through the background to these two monumental battles, as well as the two battles themselves. So, start off with probably most famous nowadays, the Battle of Philippi, because it takes the center stage, the climax of William Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar, which tells the story of Caesar's assassination and what happened to Brutus and Cassius, the two men who organized that assassination, and then up to the Battle of Philippi. And Shakespeare's play famously ends with Brutus's death at the end of the battle. And like Shakespeare, in order to understand Philippi, we must go back and look at Julius Caesar himself, the man who Shakespeare named the play after. And so, Julius Caesar, very quick overview of who he was. Top left, by the way, is probably the only portrait bust of Caesar produced during his lifetime, which shows you an interesting difference between how he was depicted in the Empire, which is bottom left there. So you can see that his portrait was definitely idealized over time, much more chiseled jaw, a lot more hair. He's got less of a receding hairline, but interesting difference there. So Caesar, he was born around 100 BC, and he reached the highest magistracy in the Republic, the consulship, in 59 BC. And by this point, Rome is very much the master of the Mediterranean world. But one place they haven't conquered yet is Gaul. And as I ran through in my previous talk, Caesar spent the 50s campaigning around Gaul, massacring millions of Gallic people and conquering the country. And he wrote his own account of this, which is really fascinating from a historical point of view and makes it very easy to follow what he actually did. And this is, of course, the great triumphant scene at the end of the Battle of Elysia, when the Gallic leader, Vercingetorix, surrenders to Caesar. And that was the sort of the climactic moment when he had conquered Gaul. Now, Caesar, the yellow bit in the top left there is the areas he conquered, the rest of the empire shown there alongside its client states. Caesar is now very, very powerful after conquering Gaul in the years 51-50 BC. So powerful, in fact, that two men in particular, Pompey the Great and Marcus Porcius Cato, start campaigning to try and bring down Caesar. And they want Caesar to stand down his generalship and become a private citizen before he returns to Rome, because that means they can prosecute Caesar and ruin him. Caesar doesn't want that. He wants to be able to pass straight from being general to being consul again. And when Pompey and Cato refuse, Caesar, he crosses the Rubicon into Italy. He invades Italy, and the civil war begins in the year 49. Pompey and Cato, they seem to be taken by surprise by this, and they flee Italy to Macedonia. Now, before pursuing them, Caesar goes west and defeats some of Pompey's supporters in Spain. That's the Battle of Ilerda. He also takes out Massilia, Marseille, on the way. But then he crosses over in the year 48 and crushes Pompey's much less experienced army at the Battle of Pharsalus. Pompey, he flees to Egypt, where he thinks he will be safe, but, as many of you probably know, he is not. He is captured by the Egyptian king and executed, and that is the end of Pompey the Great. But, nonetheless, Caesar is in hot pursuit, and when he arrives, top right there, Cleopatra, he falls into a romantic relationship with her. She's only about 20 years old at this time. He's well into his late 40s, and he helps her defeat her brother, that's the Alexandrine War, and cement her power as the one ruler of Egypt. Then he goes and takes out Pharnaces II, the king of Pontus, in a lightning campaign, which is so fast that he famously utters the words, Veni, Vidi, Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. That's the Battle of Zela. But who is still at large? Well, Cato is still at large, and he's been gathering opposition in North Africa. So Caesar crosses over to Africa and smashes the Catonian forces at the Battle of Utica. And Cato famously commits suicide rather than be captured. But the war is not over, because finally holding out in Spain are the young son of Pompey, Gnaeus Pompey the Younger, and Caesar's old right-hand man, Titus Labienus, who is turned against him, and these two put up a fierce resistance in Spain, and Caesar crosses over and defeats them in 45 BC at the Battle of Munda, and he famously said that was the hardest battle he ever fought, and really quite ferocious fighting between fellow Roman soldiers on both sides. Having won that, Labienus and Gnaeus Pompey the Younger are dead, and Caesar is undisputed champion of the Mediterranean, having won those 5 key campaigns. But he starts becoming too big for his own boots. So first he celebrates a quadruple triumph over Gaul, Egypt, Asia, and Africa. And you can see on this coin of the time the words quart. That's for the 4 triumphs that he celebrated, celebrating that unprecedented achievement. And it's fine to triumph over foreign people, but it's not fine to triumph over Romans. And when he returns from the Battle of Munda, he celebrates a 5th triumph over Labienus and the younger Pompey, and this is seen as in really bad taste. You don't celebrate triumphs over fellow Romans. And then there's the sequence of honours he is accumulating. He's not only dictator, he's also consul several times in a row. Then he appoints himself dictator for 10 years, and then in 44, dictator for life. And many Romans think that he is building up regnum. This means monarchy. And regnum, monarchy, is anathema to the Romans. The Republic was founded by overthrowing kings. So many people in Rome are very much against Caesar's accumulation of honours. Even the fact that he's put himself on this coin here, it was completely unheard of for Romans to put themselves on coins. Usually you put gods on coins. But Caesar showed himself on the coin, and that was seen as another step towards monarchy. And other things as well, like he created a temple to his own clemency. He renamed the month of Quintilius to Julius, i.e. July, after himself, and he reserved the right to have a golden throne. All of this is very worrying, and in March 44, he's just about to set off on a great conquest of the Middle East, Parthia. But 3 days before he leaves, he is struck down on the Ides of March by a group of conspirators. We know the names of about 21 of these conspirators. Most of them are men who were very close to Caesar, men like Trebonius and Decimus Brutus, who had been among his closest lieutenants during the Gallic Wars and the Civil Wars. But these men clearly came to believe that Caesar had stepped too far and was trying to become a king, a monarch. Caesar's body had 23 stab wounds in it when it was finally recovered. And, as is well known, the 2 leading conspirators were Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus. So, the first of those, Brutus. He was born around 85 BC, so about 15 years younger than Caesar, and he comes from one of the most noble families in Rome. Indeed, his ancestor a semi-legendary figure called Lucius Brutus, was supposedly the man who overthrew the kings and created the Republic in 509 BC. So Brutus puts great stock on the fact that his family stands for liberty, for freedom. His father, rather interestingly, had been killed in Rome's first civil war between Marius Sulla and another man called Lepidus, and he'd actually been murdered by Pompey. And Brutus's mother, Servilia, was famously one of Caesar's many mistresses, supposedly the only woman, who Caesar actually loved. And that led to some rather malicious rumours in antiquity that Caesar was actually Brutus's father. This is almost certainly not correct, because Caesar would have been only about 15 years old when Brutus was conceived, so not impossible, but almost certainly not true. It's more likely just a romantic rumour to make it even more sort of poetic that Brutus was the man that killed Caesar. So Caesar probably not Brutus's father. But even though Pompey had killed Brutus's father, when the civil war breaks out in 49, Brutus crosses to Macedonia and joins Pompey's side. And he is at the Battle of Pharsalus, and after the battle, he surrenders and is pardoned by Caesar. And Caesar takes him in and turns him into one of his trusted right-hand men, because this is a great propaganda coup for Caesar's regime. And indeed, 44, the year of the Ides of March, Caesar makes Brutus praetor, the second highest rank in the Republic. Some interesting contemporary evidence on the left is one of the oldest bronze statues we have, supposedly showing Lucius Junius Brutus, the man who founded the Republic. And on the right is a coin minted by our Brutus, Marcus Brutus, in around 55 BC. And you can see there that he's posted the words Libertas, freedom, and then a depiction of his ancestor Brutus. So he's advertising the fact that he, Marcus Brutus, comes from this great family that represents freedom and the Republic. And so you can start to see why he felt obliged to murder Caesar. And this, one of the most famous coins ever minted, it was minted in 43 BC, and it celebrates the Ides of March. Eid Mar, the Ides of March, and two daggers to show how the conspirators murdered Caesar. In the middle there is a hat called the pileus, and that was given to a slave when they were freed. So you can see the iconography here. What Brutus is going for is, I freed Rome when I murdered Caesar at the Ides of March. Also interestingly, Brutus has depicted himself on the other side of the coin. So even though it was unheard of for Caesar to do that, Brutus does actually follow Caesar's example and put himself on this coin there. Very interesting. These coins are very rare and they sell for hundreds of thousands when they go on the market. So what about Cassius? Well, Cassius, around the same age as Brutus, also from a noble family, the Cassii. So for example, his father, grandfather, great-grandfather, etc., had all been consuls, the highest rank in the Republic. And Cassius and Brutus were related by marriage as well, because Cassius married Brutus's half-sister. Cassius's early career is most notable because in the 50s, he joined Crassus on the Parthian campaign, which ended in disaster when Crassus and almost the entirety of his army were wiped out in the desert at the Battle of Carrhae. But Cassius, he was the man who led the survivors, escaped, and then organised the hasty defence of the Roman province of Syria. And indeed, when the Parthians, thinking they had the upper hand, invaded the Roman province, it was Cassius who beat them off and defeated them. So he's a bit of a hero in Roman eyes for successfully being the one to fight off the Parthian invasion in 52-51. He's a famous general. He also joined Pompey's side in the civil war. He also surrendered after Pharsalus, and exactly like Brutus, he was appointed praetor in the year 44. So the two leading conspirators, Brutus and Cassius, are both very important Caesarians, and they both are hold the praetorship at the point where they kill Caesar. Now, one person they did not kill was the consul Mark Antony. Now, Mark Antony obviously takes a central position in this story, so let's run through who he is as well. Top right there, by the way, is a coin minted by Antony during his life, showing you what he may have looked like. The bottom right is a bust we have from the imperial era, which is often said to be Antony. We don't know for certain. I mean, you can kind of see the similarities between the coin and the bust. We don't know for certain if that's Antony, but most people say it's probably him. So, Mark Antony, also a noble. His grandfather was a famous orator who'd been killed in the First Civil War. And he served under Caesar in Gaul. And indeed, at the Battle of Alesia, he held a key position as one of the military tribunes holding the front lines against the Gallic onslaught. In the year 49, he played a very important role in the lead up to the Civil War. He was a tribune in Rome representing Caesar's interests. And when Pompey and Cato ignored the tribune's proposals for peace, Antony, as well as some other tribunes, fled Rome to Caesar's camp, and this gave Caesar the casus belli he needed to declare war, claiming, I represent the protection of the tribunes, I'm standing for freedom, I'll protect the tribunes, like Antony. Antony commanded Caesar's left wing at Pharsalus, hugely important role. And when Caesar was dictator in the 40s, Antony was his magister equitum, which is the dictator's right-hand man. And indeed, to show how much Caesar trusted Antony, he was appointed consul in the year 44. So, to stress again, Brutus and Cassius did not kill Antony. They had the opportunity to, but they decided not to, supposedly because Brutus said, we should only kill the tyrant Caesar, we should not kill anybody else, so that we can show that we're in the right. This, of course, turned out to be a terrible mistake from their perspective. So, after the Ides of March, we have this bewildering period of switching allegiances, fast developments, and amazingly, we have almost day-to-day, certainly week-by-week, knowledge of what goes on in this period because we have the letters and speeches of Cicero, which survive. And the letters in particular are fascinating. Some of those letters from Brutus and Cassius. So we have first-hand writing from Brutus and Cassius surviving because they were included in the compendium of Cicero's letters. So we have really good knowledge about this period, but I'll run through it very quickly because it's very confusing and there's so much that happens. But basically, at first, the Liberators, as they call themselves, the conspirators, get on with Antony. Everybody agrees to have peace. But soon that turns sour because at Caesar's funeral, Antony gives a speech where he incites the people of Rome into anger. He also opens Caesar's will and reveals all the gifts that Caesar had given to the people of Rome, and they angrily burn Caesar's body in the middle of the Forum. And that spot you can still go see there nowadays, and the people of Rome nowadays still leave flowers there every day for Caesar. And in the wake of this, Brutus and Cassius fled Rome in April. Now, young 18-year-old called Gaius Octavius enters the scene. He is Caesar's great-nephew, and when Caesar's will is opened, Octavian, it is revealed, has been adopted as Caesar's son and his heir. So officially, Octavian's name changes to Gaius Julius Caesar, and Octavianus indicates that he used to be called Octavian. And just to show a bit more clearly the relationship between those two, there's Caesar in the top left. He only had one legitimate child, that's Julia, who had been married to Pompey, but she had died in 54. Caesar's sister, her grandchild was Octavian. So Octavian enters the scene, and this causes huge trouble everywhere because now we have conflicting loyalties. Some of Caesar's veterans, who are furious about the Ides of March, they look to Antony as their leader. Other of Caesar's veterans, they look to Octavian as their leader. So, in August, Brutus and Cassius leave Italy. They pretend that they're going to their provinces, as they're meant to as praetors, their provinces being Sardinia and Cyprus, but in reality, they don't. They go to Macedonia and Syria, and I'll tell you why later. From August to October 44, Antony starts scheming to get more and more powers. He's resisted by Cicero in the Senate, who becomes the mouthpiece of the Senate's cause against Antony. And all the while, Octavian is marching around Italy, gathering strength, gathering Caesar's old soldiers, his veterans, men in their 40s, their 50s, who had been fanatically loyal to Caesar. He gathers them all and he starts having a private army, essentially. And things really kick off when late in the year, Antony marches north to a place called Mutina, and he besieges one of the conspirators, one of the liberators, Decimus Brutus, not the same as Marcus Brutus. Decimus Brutus, he besieges him at Mutina. And this is the first battle of the Civil War. On one side, we have the army of the Senate sent out by Cicero, commanded by the consuls Hirtius and Pansa, as well as Octavian and Decimus Brutus trapped inside Mutina in the north of Italy. And on the other side, they are fighting against Antony. And there are two battles, the Battle of Forum Gallorum and the Battle of Mutina. Antony initially wins, then is crushed, and he flees to Gaul. However, and this is one of the most important turning points in world history, both Hirtius and Pansa are killed in the fighting. And this is the first time that both consuls have died in the same year since the Hannibalic War. And the reason this is so significant is because it leaves a power vacuum. And Octavian, even though he's only 18, 19, goes, you know what? I would like to step in and take one of those vacant consulships that Hirtius and Pansa have just left behind. So, Antony flees Italy and he goes and finds Lepidus, one of Caesar's old generals in Gaul, and they team up. There's a coin of Lepidus in the top right. Octavian, he has a U-turn, having fought for the Senate, now he turns against them. He marches on Rome and he says, make me consul, even though the legal age for the consulship is 42 years old, and he's only 18 or 19. Octavian passes a law called the Lex Pedia, which condemns all of Caesar's assassins, the Liberators, to death. So Brutus and Cassius are now wanted men. In September, Decimus Brutus in the north of Italy is captured and put to death by one of Antony's allies. Then in November, Antony, Octavian, they put aside their differences, they meet alongside Lepidus, and the three men form the Triumvirate. And this is an official, legally sanctioned post which gives them power to rule Rome for 5 years, to avenge Caesar by executing his killers, and to restore the Republic is what they claim they're doing. And one of the first things the Triumvirs do is begin the proscriptions, where they create a list of people who are now allowed to die legally. And so bounty hunters start rushing across Italy looking for these men. If they kill them, chop off their head and bring it to Octavian, Antony or Lepidus in Rome, then they get a huge reward. And the reason Antony, Octavian and Lepidus do this is not only to eliminate some of their enemies, but also for money. Because those men who are killed, their property and money is confiscated, and so Antony and Octavian can use that to fund their war. And the most famous casualty of the proscriptions is Cicero, who is tracked down and executed in December 44. And finally, at the beginning, that should say December 43, Cicero is killed. And at the beginning of 42, Caesar is officially declared a god. So Octavian's full name is now Gaius Julius Caesar Divi Filius, son of a god. And this is hugely important for Octavian's propaganda because he can now project himself as semi-divine. He's not only the adopted son and heir of Caesar, he is the adopted son and heir of a literal god. And here's one of the coins Octavian mints celebrating Divus Iulius, the divine Julius there. Now, the first time I'll introduce the problem of our sources. So, in the late Republic, the main contemporary sources we had were Cicero, his letters, speeches, treatises, and Caesar. These men are now obviously dead by the beginning of 42 BC. There were a bunch of other people in antiquity who wrote histories of this civil war, and that included Titus Livy, Asinius Pollio, Valerius Messala, and Augustus himself wrote a rather large autobiography. None of those survive. So, what we are forced to rely on are secondary sources written hundreds of years after the event, but which for us are primary sources. This rather weird situation where these men were writing about this period hundreds of years afterwards, so they are secondary sources, but for us they are the only primary evidence we have to find out what happened. And in particular, three sources: Plutarch, who was writing around 100 AD. He wrote biographies where he paired a Greek person with a Roman person, parallel lives, and described their lives in a biography. That included a life of Anthony and a life of Brutus. Now, Plutarch is very useful to have because he was a studious researcher, and he seems to have read a lot of those primary sources on the left, but he's also not a historian. He's a biographer. There's a difference there, and also his interest is in particular about telling a moral story, about the ethics of people's lives. What lessons can we learn from, for example, from Antony or from Brutus about how to be a good man, or indeed how to avoid being a bad man? So he's not a historian, he's a biographer with a particular ethical slant. There is also Appian, who's writing slightly later than Plutarch. He's Greek, he lives in Egypt, both of which comes with their own problems. Could he even read Latin very well? We're not very sure. But he writes this large Roman history from 133 BC down to 36 BC, divided into themes like the Macedonian Wars, the Italian Wars, and the Civil Wars. Now, Appian is the most continuous account we have, but he gets very confused. He often doesn't understand what he's talking about or what he's reading, and he makes a lot of errors as well. And that's probably down to how he researched his sources, where he read through all the things, made notes, then he had to divide it up into themes. Okay, this book's about the Macedonian War, this book's about the Italian Wars, these books around the Civil Wars, and in the process he seems to have got a little bit confused. So he's not entirely reliable or trustworthy, even though he is the largest source we have. And finally, there's also Dio Cassius, who's writing even later, also in Greek, and he writes this fantastically long history all the way from 509 BC to 229 AD. And again, very similar to Appian, he is not entirely reliable. He rushes through some events because he's covering such a large period of history, whereas he dedicates huge amounts of time to other events. So you can see how these, our main sources, are primary sources, even though they're actually secondary sources. All of them come with their own issues. And that, as I'll try to spell out later, affects how we understand the battle. So, what were Brutus and Cassius doing when the triumvirate was being formed? Well, Brutus, he went to Macedonia. Cassius went to Syria. And they very quickly took control of these provinces. And soon after they'd marched around gathering all the legions that were there, because remember, Caesar was planning to invade Parthia, so Caesar had left loads of legions in the east, ready for that. Well, Brutus and Cassius now, they go around collecting these legions under their banner, and very soon, by the start of 42, they have 21 legions under their command, plus allies. And that's around 90,000 men on paper. Now, I say on paper because some of these legions would have been under strength. They wouldn't have been as strong as they should have been. So that's the theoretical amount of troops they had. Might have been a little less. Now, it should also be stressed that these troops were veterans, most of them. In war, the most important thing is morale. Are your troops going to stand and keep fighting, or are they going to turn around and run away? And inexperienced troops in antiquity often turn around and run away. And that's why a smaller, experienced army of veterans, like Caesar had in the Civil War, can smash a much larger force just by having the courage to stay together. So Brutus and Cassius, it's significant that a lot of their troops are veterans of previous wars. The Triumvirs, on the other hand, so Octavian, Anthony and Liberators, they have a larger army, around 40 legions altogether, once they've collected them from across the Western Mediterranean. And on paper, that's around 170,000 men. These figures, by the way, come from the famous historian Peter Brunt, his seminal work, Italian Manpower. And of course, the main aim of the Liberators, Brutus and Cassius, is to free the Republic from the tyranny of the Triumvirs, as they see it. And the main aim of the Triumvirs is to cross over to the east and avenge Caesar by killing Brutus and Cassius. What do Roman legionaries actually look like at this time? Well, not like this. This is how Roman legionaries are often depicted, with the famous lorica segmentata of these overlapping metal plates in their armour. This is more from the High Empire. So if you look there at Trajan's column on the left, you can see very clearly the soldiers wearing the lorica segmentata. At this stage, in the last century of the Republic, they're probably wearing chainmail suits like this. And if you look at the altar of Ahenobarbus on the left, one of the few contemporary depictions of soldiers we have, you can see that they are wearing chainmail suits. And on the right there, you can see what they might have looked like on the march, carrying their pack equipment. If we look a little closer at our legionary here, he has got his gladius sword, the relatively small but extremely sharp sword that is for stabbing. It is a stabbing sword. You don't slice with this, you do small, short stabs into the belly, into the chest, and the idea is that by stabbing with these small, short stabs like this, you can actually kill a lot more men a lot more safely than if you're swinging your sword rather cumberously around in slicing motions. Each legionary also has their pila spears, which can be used as weapons in their own right, but they're mainly thrown as javelins at the start of the battle. And these are so deadly because in antiquity, most armies would put their best troops on the front line. They are the bravest, most courageous troops who will show the rest of the army how to fight. Whereas the Romans come charging in, they throw 2 volleys of deadly javelins and bam, all your best, most courageous troops have now been cut down in 2 javelin volleys. So that's why the pila are so important. He also has his large scutum shield, often shown painted red because the surviving examples we have are red. And in the middle of that shield is the important metal boss. That's not only to help deflect blows, but also to punch. You would punch your enemies with your shield, hitting them with that metal boss, which would disorientate them, knock them down, and then you would quickly stab in with your gladius to finish them off. And each legionary, we're told by the ancient writer Polybius, needed a space of around 1.8 by 1.8 meters, which is quite big if you think about it. That's a 6 foot tall man. And the reason they need this is to be able to have the space to maneuver their shield and their gladius in the correct motion. So they're not sort of packed in tightly next to each other. There's a little bit of gap between each legionary to give him the room to maneuver. And if they became too crowded, then that could lead to a bloodbath, because the legionaries can't hold their shield up properly, they can't stab properly with their gladius, and so they are ripe for the slaughter. And so at the Battle of Cannae, for example, the worst defeat the Romans ever suffered, the reason why it was such a bloodbath is they got hemmed in, they didn't have their 1.8 by 1.8 fighting zone, and they couldn't fight back against the Carthaginian forces. And very quickly, what does a legion actually look like? Well, it slightly varies in size, depending on what period you're talking about, but around 4,200 to 5,200 men, plus allies and cavalry. And that's divided into 10 cohorts. Each cohort contains 6 centuries. Each century is 80 men, and each century is also led by a centurion. And within those centuries, the smallest unit is the contubernium, which is around 8 to 10 tent mates who sleep in the same tent and will be a cohesive unit together, looking out for each other on the battlefield. The typical formation by this period was the triple achies, where you have 3 lines of your forward, your middle, and your back lines. The front line would engage the enemy, throw the pila and charge in. The second line would be held in reserve for the pivotal moment of the battle when they would engage and hopefully overwhelm the enemy. And the third line is your reserves, could be engaged, but often would be held back, possibly for the whole battle, if we sort of read Caesar's accounts. And most of these soldiers are between 17 and 49 years old. They are ordinary citizens who have been conscripted or volunteered. And just to stress again, the best troops are the veterans, because they are the ones with the best morale. They are less likely to run away, and they are more likely to hold their ground. And the real slaughter in an ancient battle begins when one of the two sides turns around and runs away. Another thing that legionaries would have to do on a daily basis is construction. So wherever they stopped, they would build a camp, and the camps always followed a standard layout, as you can see on the left. And some of these camps would be very large, as you can see in the picture at the bottom, with ditches, a palisade wall, towers. And as we'll see shortly, when I show you the battlefield at Philippi, camps play a leading role in the battle. So, 42 BC, the build-up to the battle. Brutus and Cassius, they gather their forces together in Asia Minor. Then they move and cross the Dardanelles into Thrace. Now, Octavian and Anthony, they leave Liberators behind looking after Rome, and it's their job now to cross over to Macedonia. And there's a striking parallel with the earlier civil war, when Pompey was in Macedonia and Caesar had to cross over from Italy to go find and fight him. Very similar situation now in 43-42. Brutus and Cassius, it should be stressed as well, are being joined all the time by hundreds of young men whose fathers had died in the first civil war or afterwards. For example, Cicero's son goes and joins Brutus and Cassius. The son of Marcus Porcius Cato goes and joins them. And the young Horace, who's one of the most famous poets of this period, he also goes and joins them. But also at play is Sextus Pompey, the younger son of Pompey the Great, and he takes over Sicily, which is rather a thorn in Octavian and Antony's backs, and threatens their crossing over the Adriatic Sea, because Pompey is basically becoming a pirate lord, rampaging the coast of Italy. Also, to complicate things, Brutus and Cassius, they send a fleet round into the Adriatic Sea to try and stop Octavian and Antony from crossing over. But Octavian and Antony manage to avoid the blockade thanks to favourable winds, and they cross over in the late spring, and then they advance over the summer up the Via Egnatia towards Thrace, where they are. And this is what the Via Egnatia looks like now. It's the main Roman road connecting West and East Macedonia. So this is the area. Don't need to run in all the maneuvers before the battle in much detail. What we basically need to know is that Brutus and Cassius advance from east to west and stop at the town of Philippi. They are also shadowed by a large fleet off coast who port at the town of Neapoli. And this is significant because it means Brutus and Cassius have supremacy over the waters and are able to supply themselves by sea. In contrast, Antony, who arrives first, he does not have support from sea. He's marched all the way from Italy. He's relatively isolated, and Octavian joins him later in the summer. So these guys, Octavian and Antony, they need to force a battle because they are not well supplied. They are in enemy territory, so it's on them now to try and start the fighting. Whereas Brutus and Cassius can largely wait to see what Antony and Octavian do. This is what the field of Philippi looks like nowadays. You can see ancient Neapolis, modern Kavala, down in the bottom right. That's where Brutus and Cassius's fleet was. And the bit in the middle, which says Archaeologos Koros Philippon, that's the ancient town of Philippi, now a ruin. And the fighting took place mainly in this broad area around here, where I've circled there, on the plain of Philippi, hemmed in, as you can see, by steep hills to the west, south, north, and east. You can also, rather interestingly, actually see the outlines of where the Via Egnatia used to run, and the modern Greek roads still follow that outline quite clearly nowadays. So this is what the ruins of Philippi look like. It was founded by Philip of Macedon, and it was a pretty typical Greek town with a lower city and an acropolis. It's probably most famous, apart from the battle, because it was one of the early Christian centres. So this is the rather impressive remains of a large basilica, Kairos, the symbol of Christianity, and a very old mosaic that actually mentions St. Paul, who visited Philippi on his travels around Europe. And this is looking towards the site of ancient Philippi from the plain. And I'll come back to this picture in a bit. So, just to reiterate, our main sources are Appian, Plutarch, and Dio Cassius. They do not agree on all their details. They contradict each other on some pretty basic points. And so we have to read between the lines to try and reconstruct what happened at the battle. But behind these three sources we have the original sources which they were relying on. What were they? Well, Valerius Messala was a politician at the time. He was later consul in 31 BC, and he was at the battle, and he wrote memoirs about his life, and that included an account of Philippi. And there was also Lucius Bibulus was at the battle, and he wrote a biography of Brutus. So both of these people were there fighting for Brutus and Cassius. They after the battle, they surrendered and joined Octavian, but they fought at the battle on the side of the Liberators. So these two were one of the key sources that Appian, Plutarch, and Dio Cassius would have been reading. In addition, there was Asinius Pollio, another politician from this period. He was later consul in the year 40, and he became a historian in his elder years, and he wrote a history of Rome's civil wars, which went from the year 60 BC down to the Battle of Philippi, which was the apex, the climax of his history. He wasn't at the battle, however. At the time, he was governor of Gaul on Antony's behalf, so even though he's a contemporary, he was not at the battle. Nonetheless, he presumably was able to talk to people who were there, and so his account was also very important for Appian, Plutarch, and Dio Cassius. There was also Livy, who is the most famous historian of Roman history. Some of Livy's books survive to the present day. The books for the Civil War do not survive, they are lost, but he was alive at the time, so again, he would have been able to speak to people at the battle and research it. And there's also Augustus's own autobiography, again, lost, but this was a considerable work. It was 13 volumes long, and it's clear that Augustus did talk about the Battle of Philippi in his autobiography. So these are the kind of sources that Appian, Plutarch, and Dio Cassius had access to. The problem is that if we take Appian, for example, he was reading several of these sources, he was making quick notes, and he wasn't really paying much attention to which information he got from where, and so his account ends up being quite confused and confusing. Now, as a result, the various attempts to reconstruct what the battle looked like will inevitably look a little bit different. And all of these probably look different to the fantastic map which you have in the room there today, because ultimately we don't have a lovely, neat description like Caesar provided for his battles during the Gallic Wars. We don't have that because the sources are too short and too confused. So all these different maps are slightly different to one another, and so to try and square the difference, I went and I had a go at drawing my own one, which sort of shows on the most basic level what the battlefield would have looked like. So we have Philippi in the middle there, the small ancient town. We have steep hills to the north and the east, the Via Egnatia running through the middle of the field, and a marsh to the south, and a small river, more like a stream really, called the Ganges, which runs down the middle of the battlefield. We don't know exactly where it ran because it's changed course over time. And in late September, Brutus and Cassius, they come up from Neapolis and they set their two camps either side of the Via Egnatia, somewhere around here. Brutus closer to the hills, Cassius closer to the marsh. And between them, they build a palisade fortification 2.7 kilometers long, with an accompanying ditch, a moat, to help defend it. And you can see that this is a really well defended position. So you've got around 90,000 men in this area around these two camps, and they are protected by the hills behind them. They have a small river to help protect the camps. They have a deep marsh to the south, which will be hard to get through. And they've managed to build these fortifications in advance. So it looks like they are very much in the stronger position. And they are easily supplied by sea, with that fleet based only down the road at Neapolis. And so their strategy, rather sensibly, is wait. We have the stronger position. We have the upper hand. We will wait to see what Antony and Octavian do. This is one of the only archaeological remains that's been discovered. A bit of the rampart accompanying the palisade wall has been excavated by archaeologists, and there is a rather old picture showing the ditch. So Antony and Octavian, they arrive from the west, and they set up camp somewhere around here in the plain of Philippi to the west. Now, they have a larger army, 110,000 men, but they are in a much worse position. And in particular, to stress again, they are not well supplied. They don't have access to the sea, they've come a long way, and so they really need to force a battle rather quickly. They can't wait out like Brutus and Cassius want to. So Antony in particular is very keen to start the battle. He's the leading commander of the two, he's the more experienced, and he takes a very aggressive stance. Every day he organizes the army up into formation. Brutus and Cassius respond by organizing their army in formation, but Brutus and Cassius refuse to engage, and this little game of cat and mouse goes on for over a week. Now, to return to this picture, you can kind of trace out the broad outline of where the different forces would have been. Brutus's camp at the foot of the hills over there, Cassius slightly to the south, the marsh further to the south, and Antony Octavian somewhere in this field to the west. And if we're looking from the top of the hills, Brutus's camp somewhere down there at the foot of the hill, and Antony Octavian somewhere out there on the plain. But to stress again, there's been very little archaeological discoveries, so this is all kind of guesswork where exactly these camps would have been. And one point to stress is this was going to be one of the largest battles ever at the time. 200,000 Roman troops, more or less, were now gathered in the field at Philippi, and a lot of these troops were experienced veterans who are likely going to go down fighting. Now, so the Liberators, Antony and Octavian, they come, they march out, they offer battle, but the Liberators refuse to engage. So, seeing this, Antony, for 10 days, secretly starts building a causeway, a wooden causeway, into the marsh. And he's hidden by the tall reeds on either side in the marsh so that no one can see what he's doing on the other side. And his goal here, of course, is to flank Cassius to the south. However, on the 1st or the 2nd of October, Cassius realizes what is going on. They spot the causeway being built. And so he starts building a counter-fortification to the south to cut off Antony. When Antony sees this on the 3rd of October, he gambles. He realizes that the battle needs to be won before Cassius can complete that fortification. So Antony launches an all-out attack. The troops in the marsh, they charge. The troops on Antony's wing, which is the east wing, they charge. And Brutus's troops see this from afar, from 2 kilometers away, and they respond by charging themselves. So you have both right wings charging into the opposite left wing of the battle. And in the south, Antony's men smash through Cassius's lines. They break through the palisade and they enter his camp, and Cassius flees to the east. But meanwhile in the north, the exact opposite has happened. Brutus has smashed through Octavian's lines and entered his camp, and Octavian flees to the south and hides rather ignominiously in the marsh. And so both sides are now in the other side's camp, pillaging, stealing as much money, as many slaves, as much booty as they can. And we are told by the sources that dust was being kicked up across the battlefield. So it was very hard for Brutus, 2.5 kilometers away, to tell that Cassius was being defeated all the way over there. And it was hard for Cassius to know what had happened to Brutus, and Cassius thinks the battle is lost, and on the evening of the 3rd commits suicide, the noble thing for a defeated general to do. The accounts of his death vary slightly. Some sources claim that Brutus was on the brink of sending messengers to tell Cassius that they'd won, but Cassius saw these horsemen charging towards him and thought they were Antony's troops, so stabbed himself. All we know for certain is that Cassius did kill himself. So now both sides return to their respective camps, and the Triumvirs, Antony and Octavian, have lost more men. Around 18,000 men, according to Messala, who remember was there, and he's quoted by Appian, whereas Brutus and Cassius only lost around 9,000 men. So the Liberators came out on top. But, of course, they have a heavy morale. Their morale has been hit heavily because one of the two generals, the more experienced general, Cassius, the hero of Parthia, is now dead. And to try and counteract this morale debuff, Brutus moves his HQ down so he can be closer to Cassius's troops. But the Triumvirs are overall still in a weak position. They don't have supplies. They are getting hungry. It's starting to rain a lot, and their camp down on the plain floods, and that is made even worse when Brutus's clever engineers redirect the course of the river to flood into Antony and Octavian's camp, which, remember, has been pillaged as well. So they're in quite a desperate position. And on the very same day as the first Battle of Philippi, some reinforcements had tried to cross the Adriatic Sea and had been caught by Brutus and Cassius's fleet and sunk. So Octavian and Antony, the reinforcements they were hoping would arrive, were massacred. So they are in a really quite desperate position. And Brutus is still happy to play that war of attrition. He's in the much stronger position. He is going to wait. And so Antony realizes that something needs to be done, and he moves the majority of his army into the marsh. He's going to try and attack Brutus from the south. And this is when we move to focus on the south, where he builds a series of camps, probably 3 or 4 camps, down to the south of Brutus' position. And he's trying to flank Brutus and force him into another battle. So, focusing in on that southern area, our sources claim that Brutus didn't want to fight. He wanted to keep waiting. But his officers and his ordinary troops were getting so fed up that they forced Brutus to come forward and engage Antony. That's what the sources say. It's probably a literary device, sort of a romantic take on the tale. Our poor noble Brutus, he didn't want to fight. He had a wise plan of waiting it out, but his rash officers convinced him to fight. So it's probably a literary device. In reality, Brutus is probably concerned about being cut off. If Antony and Octavian continue those fortifications to the south, it will sever Brutus's supply lines to Neapolis by the coast. So, on the 23rd of October, Brutus decides to march forward and give battle. And now, so we are at 90 degrees from where the previous battle took place, and we're down in the south on the foots of the marsh. And this part of the battle is particularly unclear. The sources really don't help us out. So it's sort of anyone's guess how Octavian and Antony end up winning this part of the battle so convincingly. What we do know is that at one point, Octavian manages to break through and actually capture the entrance to Brutus's camp. So Brutus's troops can't retreat back into the camp. We also hear that at one point, Antony smashes through the middle and starts to come back round again and encircle the rest of Brutus's troops. And remember, when that encirclement happens and the legionaries start getting pushed closer and closer, they can't fight properly because they can't engage with their 1.8 by 1.8 fighting space, and so it becomes a slaughter. And we do know for certain that towards the late afternoon, Brutus fled to the hills with the survivors, which was around 4 legions, enough perhaps to mount a resistance, but of course he decides to commit suicide on the evening of the 23rd. As Shakespeare famously says at the end of the play, He calls Brutus the noblest Roman of all, and he has Antony looking down over Brutus's dead body and giving a soliloquy about the noble murdered tyrannicide. There are conflicting accounts of what actually happens to Brutus's body. Some sources claim that Octavian cut off the head and sent it back to Rome to be flung before the statue of Caesar. Other sources claim that Antony gave Brutus a honourable cremation and sent his ashes to his mother. Most of the survivors of the battle from the Liberators' side, they surrendered to Antony and Octavian. That's probably somewhere in the region of 15,000 men. And it included the poet Horace, who was there. It included Messala and Bibulus, who went on to write their accounts of the battle. So these men survive and they surrender and actually join Octavian and Antony's side. But some men do escape and continue the fight. They go and join Sextus Pompey, Pompey the Great's son, who, remember, was based in Sicily. And the estimated casualties in the second battle, we don't know for certain, but Peter Brunt estimates that the Triumvirs only lost around 2,000 men, whereas Brutus lost more like 12,000 men. And that included many of the finest young nobles of the time. So the young Cato, son of the famous Cato who killed himself at Utica, the young Lucullus, son of the famous Lucullus general who fought 30 years earlier against Mithridates, the young Hortensius. So lots of these famous nobles die at Philippi. And indeed, Cato, the young Cato, trying to emulate his glorious father, when he sees that the battle is lost, he decides to take off his helmet so everyone can see who he is, and he does a suicide charge straight into the middle of Antony's ranks to make sure that he gets cut down in battle in noble death. So Philippi really spells the death of the Republic. A whole generation of the nobility who were at the core of Republican politics. If they weren't killed at Pharsalus, if they weren't killed at the prescriptions, now they've been cut down on the field of Philippi. And overall, between the two battles, the beginning and end of October, we're probably talking about 40,000 Romans all in all killed, which makes it one of the bloodiest battles in Roman history in terms of troops lost from Rome. Now, very quickly, the aftermath. Well, Octavian and Mark Antony, they divide the Mediterranean between them. Lepidus is sidelined. Antony takes the east, Octavian takes the west. Octavian successfully defeats Sextus Pompey and executes him in a series of campaigns. Antony fails to do what Caesar wanted to do and conquer Parthia. But what he does do, of course, is hitch up with the Queen of Egypt, Cleopatra, who had previously hitched up with Julius Caesar. Well, now Antony and Cleopatra, they become lovers, they have twins together, and this is gold dust for Octavian because he is able to portray Antony as this degenerate Eastern monarch who is trying to sell Rome to the wicked Egyptian queen. So Octavian rallies Italy to his cause and declares war on Antony. And, of course, defeats him in 31 BC. So over a decade after the Battle of Philippi, he defeats him decisively at the naval battle of Actium. And after another few months of fighting, Antony dies and Cleopatra kills herself. And, of course, Octavian, renamed Augustus in 27 BC, and becomes Rome's first emperor. So that is the story of Philippi in a hopefully explaining the background and the two battles. I'll leave you with the words of Horace and Virgil, two contemporary poets. Horace, remember, was at the battle, and here he remembers in one of his poems how he ran away. I was there with you, the person he's talking to in the poem. In that headlong flight, I left my shield behind, and Mercury dragged me in fear away in a thickening cloud. So he's basically describing how he was one of those men who ran away from the battle. Whereas Virgil, he imagines a time when a farmer labouring in the fields will discover spears, helmets, and bones left over from all those 40,000 or so Roman citizens who lost their lives at Philippi. And if anyone's interested in further reading, the three best books I've encountered about this period are Josiah Osgood's Caesar's Legacy, which discusses the whole period of the Triumvirate, Catherine Tempest's biography of Brutus, and the Osprey book dedicated to the Battle of Philippi, which is particularly good on military history. Okay, sorry that was slightly longer than probably was meant to be, but hopefully that gives a comprehensive overview of the battle for you guys.
Thank you very much, Greg. Greg, just a couple of questions, if that's okay. What's your thoughts on why the archaeology hasn't uncovered any of the weaponry or relics really of the battlefield? Given its size, one would have expected they would have recovered something, but they don't seem to have been able to find anything, notwithstanding both the digs so far.
It's a very fertile area. If I go back to this sort of map of the period, you can see how many farms are in that plain, and the marsh is long gone. It's been turned into fields. So my explanation most likely is that the farming over centuries, millennia indeed, has removed essentially all remains of the battlefield, because plows and tractors will churn up the weapons, the bones, the ammunition from the battle and destroy it, is the most likely explanation.
Any other questions?
So you've got Octavian and Anthony allies. The battle ends. What causes them then to suddenly turn on each other, or is it just they can only be one great man?
So they are both competing to be Caesar's heir. Octavian literally, because, you know, he's been adopted and his name is now Gaius Julius Caesar. But Antony in a more metaphorical, but no less literal sense, that he was Caesar's right-hand man. And a lot of the veterans look to Antony as their leader. So you are right that it's sort of a classic case of there can only be one, and they can't both be the heir to Caesar. But there are a series of events that leads to them falling out. There's the famous Perusine War, which happens only a year after Philippi, where Antony's wife and brother actually basically cause a war against Octavian back in Italy, which is rather embarrassing for Antony. Octavian and Antony try and mend those wounds. Antony marries Octavian's sister, Octavia. But then, of course, when Antony goes to the east and starts cavorting with Cleopatra, that is a huge humiliation for Octavian and his sister, who is Antony's real wife. So that adds more and more tension between the two, where Octavian doesn't like seeing his sister humiliated in this manner. And then it's sort of Octavian is able to play into the rhetoric of Antony being in the east, away from Rome. He's under the spell of the wicked Egyptian queen. He's trying to move the capital of the empire to Alexandria. He wants to become a pharaoh. All these kind of claims which Octavian starts making throughout the 30s BC until it reaches boiling point in 32-31, and there's no option but war between them. It should be stressed that Octavian, when he declares war on Antony, technically he declares war on Cleopatra, because he wants to try and portray himself not as starting another civil war, but as Rome taking on Egypt. And the conquest of Egypt is sort of Octavian's crowning glory, which he comes back to in his later propaganda, trying to portray it not as another civil war, but as a war against the Egyptians.
As a follow-up, then Lepidus just keeps his head down in North Africa and lives out a long and successful Roman life.
He does indeed, yes. So Lepidus is by far the weaker of the three. From the very beginning, he's left behind whilst the other two become generals and leaders of the legions. And if you have troops underneath you, then you have power. And so when they come down to renegotiate the triumvirate after 5 years, Octavian and Antony basically sideline Lepidus. They give him North Africa, the least important area. But he is a survivor. You're exactly right. He lives out for several decades longer. And Octavian, or as he becomes Augustus, he can't just murder Lepidus because he's claiming to be, the restorer of peace, Octavian. So he waits for Lepidus to die, but this is particularly awkward because Lepidus is actually Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest. Caesar had been Pontifex Maximus. When he's murdered, Lepidus becomes Pontifex Maximus, but Augustus wants to be Pontifex Maximus, so he has to wait and wait and wait until Lepidus finally dies of old age, and Augustus can take on the mantle of chief priest, Pontifex Maximus. So you're exactly right, Lepidus does survive, but is sidelined in when the Triumvirate is renegotiated in the 30s.
Thank you.
Just one for you. When Octavian is raising the veterans, these old men in their 40s and 50s who have left the Eagles, they're resigned, how are they equipped? Presumably they hadn't taken their arms and armour home with them. Who provided the armour, the shields, the equipment, etc.?
That's a very good question. Yes, I mean, you have armories, obviously, in the towns across Italy where arms will be stored in the event of a conscription, a rapid rallying of troops. But I think some of the troops may well have taken the arms home with them. The traditional Roman soldier has to pay for his own equipment. By this point in the 1st century BC, that is slightly breaking down, where you do have poorer citizens signing up for the army whose equipment is provided by the state, although the money for that will be subtracted from the soldiers' wages. But some soldiers may well have taken weapons home with them when they retired to the colonies across Italy that Caesar set up. And so when Octavian is marching around in the years 44 and 43 BC across these towns of Italy, rallying up the veterans, and in many cases, the arms will be readily available, either in the homes or in the armories, and Octavian can always just pay for more because he is absolutely loaded because he is, of course, Caesar's main heir, and Caesar was the richest man in the Mediterranean. But it is a very interesting question, yes, this remobilization of these troops who thought their fighting days were over, but now that their great hero Caesar has been murdered, they re-enter the scene and fight either for Antony, Caesar's spiritual successor, or for Octavian, Caesar's literal successor.
Thanks very much. Well, that's great. Thanks so much, Greg. It's been a fantastic talk, and you've covered a huge amount in the time, and your slides have been fantastic.